And I took an awful long time to call myself an alcoholic. Would I call myself an alcoholic now?
Looking back on it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. She said, I don't like you anymore. I don't love you anymore. And I'm leaving before I hate you. But I could stop any time I wanted.
You really still believe that?
Yes, I did. I could stop any time I wanted, but not today. And I realised what I'd become. That I was this horrible, selfish, self-centred person that would have tramped over the top of anybody just to get a drink.
So today we're going to talk to you about your story, which is, I think, really powerful.
Yep.
First of all, just give us a little bit about kind of your background. Tell us about your family.
My family, we lived in a little town called Kirkintilloch, which is about 10 miles from Glasgow. At least it was 10 miles from Glasgow. It's now a bit closer as everything gets built up round about it. Ironically, it was a dry town. It had no pubs at all.
All right.
Yeah, it had no pubs at all for quite a long time, you know. Ironically, the pubs opened when I turned 18, you know, which is just a coincidence. I was an only child. My mother had rhesus negative and she lost 3 other children. So I became, can we say, rather precious, you know, and I was not a good kid to be overprotected. I was a squirmy kid, you know. You get these kids, you pick them up in the side, and they don't want to be held, you know, and so I wasn't very good at that, you know.
Were they? I know it's west of Scotland. Is there a culture of drinking in the west of Scotland?
Oh yes, I mean it's there's a culture of 3 things in the west of Scotland, or at least there was at that time. One was drinking, 2 was guilt, and the third one was bigotry. You know, so you know we had our culture.
Yes.
You know, and there was a lot of bigotry, Catholic Protestant stuff.
Yeah, and that was really strong, didn't it?
Oh, it was extremely strong, you know. And in fact, one of the things that really puzzled me was when I was young, we lived almost in the centre of town, just off the centre of town. And when I went to school, aged 5, we had to walk past this school to go to another school.
Yeah.
It was the school almost across the road. And that was the first time I really realised that I was a Catholic. That was a Protestant school across the road, and you know, so there was that. And I left there with lots of friends, and I came back a pape. I was a dirty pape by the time I came back as a Catholic, and that was just the. Funnily enough, I mean, when you grow up in that, you just accept it as normal. And it wasn't until much later I was trying to tell somebody from England about it, and they just looked at me and said, "What are you talking about?" You know, and I thought, "Yeah, it's a bit crazy, isn't it?" But it took me a long time to realise that.
What would you say was the most formative thing of your childhood?
Probably religion, funnily enough.
Yeah.
I was an altar boy, and I really enjoyed it. My parents were, I wouldn't say they were devout Catholics, but they were certainly practicing Catholics, you know, every Sunday, you know, and we had the holy pictures and the statues and all of that stuff, you know. And 12, I decided that I didn't want to be an altar boy anymore. I wanted to be a priest. So came in and announced to my parents that I wanted to go away and become a priest, and my mother was absolutely horrified.
Oh, was she?
Yes, the only son going off to the priesthood, you know, and she said it was far too young. So I went and got the parish priest, who got the archbishop, who came along, and you know, with all that clergy, my mother had to say yes, and off I went.
Yeah.
Off I went to preschool. You know, it was like, you know, Hogwarts with hymns, you know, and it was sort of. It was. I loved it.
Did you?
I did. I loved it to begin with, because all of a sudden I had this big family. You know, there was all these boys, because it was boarding school, obviously.
Yeah.
You know?
So you weren't an outcast anymore. You were in with the in crowd.
Well, wouldn't go that far. I was in, and but they had lots of sports, and and it was it was a good time, because one of the things I hated when I was a kid was all these kids when you were out playing and they went off in twos and threes, and I went off by myself. I was kind of lonely, a lonely kid.
Yeah.
I lasted at the priest college till I was 16.
I was going to say, because you're not a priest now, so why?
Yeah, you noticed. Well, it's actually a kind of odd story, because you had a father confessor, and I was beginning to get, shall we say, urges.
Right. Okay. Urges. Yeah.
Yes, urges.
Yeah.
And we didn't talk about urges very much, And so I went to talk to the father confessor, who just happened. The school we were at, it was a 500-acre farm. It was a huge place. And he was the farm manager, as well as being a priest. And he sat down and he told me about the coos and the bulls.
Right. That's cows and bulls.
Yes, which was not the most romantic way to find out about it, And I just hope that didn't sort of, form my sort of relationships for later life, But all of a sudden, I thought, no, I can't cope. I couldn't cope with celibacy, and so I said,
and you said that to them, did they give you time to think about it?
Yeah, about 10 minutes or something, When you had doubts, they tended to ship you out.
Did they?
Yes, because I think they thought doubt was like COVID that spread, so I was shipped out and back to school. I went back to school, the school that I left, and that was really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I know a little bit about your story, and I feel that I've often wondered why you ended up, drinking as heavily as you did. And nowadays, you'd never do that. You know that that's really, highly emotionally abusive to just, one thing and then they just can't let them get rid of them, So the shock of that for you must have been really difficult.
It was really difficult, because I'd come out of this kind of place where everything was kind of geared towards religion. And I mean, two things that were difficult. One was the place that I'd come from into the real world.
Yeah.
People in a priest college were all very nice to each other, except on the football field, but that was another matter, But most of the time they were very nice to each other. And, as I've said before, it's the sort of place you could have had a reign of terror with a balloon and a stick. It's that kind of place. And then you go back to my old school, and people didn't spare your feelings, and it was Holy John, or look at here he comes, the saint, and I tried to continue with going to mass every morning. I tried to do all of that and be part of it as well. I tried to learn to swear, and it sounded very prissy when I was saying it, because I tried to learn to smoke, and I managed that eventually. And then I learned to drink. But I tried to be part of the crowd, and I found it really difficult, because like everything else, I think I went a wee bit over the top.
So you sat on a load of actually quite sensitive, when that spiritual bit of you begins to grow, that's a really lovely part of yourself. So you had to close all that down.
Absolutely. Well, I kind of drifted away from it. I didn't close it down all at once. I kind of drifted away from it, and then eventually I stopped it. But I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel at home, and I felt like an outcast. There were two groups of people. There were the what we used to call the SWATs and the blots. There were the people who were all the A stream
nerds,
students. Yeah. And I was one of them.
Yeah.
I was one of the A stream students, because I was quite bright. But I wanted to be with the others, who were much more interesting, much more exciting, much more daring. And I had a foot in either camp, and I was not actually completely at home or even sort of accepted in either camp. So I became a wee bit of a loner again.
Yeah. So kind of a division going on inside, really, isn't there?
Yeah.
Who you were and who you wanted to be.
Yeah.
So where then did drink, when did it start happening? Obviously, you couldn't drink in your own
Yeah.
town. So what did you do?
Oh no, we could still manage to drink in our own town to begin
yeah.
with, because there was off sales.
Mm.
There weren't any pubs. There were off sales. We started drinking at parties as you did as teenagers, and I think I just loved it. I loved alcohol. I mean, right from the word go. I didn't realise that, but many years later, looking back at the effect that alcohol had. In fact, eventually, when I went to an AA meeting, somebody came out with this saying, and because I didn't identify with AA at all at the beginning, but then they came out with this saying: when they found alcohol, they found the bit that God had left out. And when he said that, I went, "That's it.
That's how
That's
you
it.
felt. Yeah.
That's how I felt. I felt invisible.
Mm-hmm.
If I was in a crowd, I felt invisible. If in a 1-to-1, fine.
Mm.
1-to-2, 1-to-3, no. 1-to-4, and is it the more people that were there, the more invisible I got.
Mm.
And then I found alcohol, and I went, "Hey, that was wonderful," because then all of a sudden I wasn't invisible anymore. I had confidence.
Right. That's
You
the
know,
key thing, isn't it? When
yeah,
you begin to take things.
I was funny.
Mm.
I was intelligent. I was really interesting. And as I've often said, I was God's gift to women.
Yes.
Funnily enough, the women didn't agree,
Mhm.
and nobody else agreed that I was funny, interesting, or anything.
Yeah.
I often thought I was the life and soul of the party, even when they were throwing me out.
Mm. Right.
That's the way I felt. But alcohol transformed my life.
Mm.
It was a transformation. It is a mind-altering drug, and it certainly altered mine.
Yeah.
And so yes, I loved it. I loved it. But I didn't have a problem at the beginning, I think.
And I know that I met you years ago because you kind of joined the hippie culture, which was kind of new,
I
and
was.
that is a part of you, this kind of individualistic, artistic kind of
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah.
Was there a drinking culture with that culture as well?
With hippies.
Yeah.
Oh, aye. Yeah. When I first met you, I mean, I was drunk when I first met you.
Yeah.
And I was drunk and scrumpy.
Yeah, it's good. Easy to get drunk on scrumpy.
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
cheap to get drunk and scrumpy as well.
Yeah.
And yes, there was that. We spent a lot of time in the horse and groom,
Yeah.
and and there was the drugs and the alcohol.
So you then began to add drugs to the drinking.
Oh, aye. I mean, part of the reason I left Kirkintilloch was there was no drugs. Not only was there no pubs, there was no drugs.
Mm.
There used to be an old sort of what was it, the Little Britain, that used to do this sketch, the
Yes.
only gay in town. Well, I
Yes.
was the only hippie in Kirkintilloch at that time.
Yeah.
I was it. In fact, my mother used to cross the road when she saw me coming because the way I dressed. There's your son over there, and it's not my son. No, no.
Yeah, but you're actually describing kind of both isolation as well as being in the center of things. There's this kind of sense of being divided from a part of yourself. So the drinking then got worse and worse?
Yeah. The drinking got worse, yeah.
Can I ask a question people might
Sure.
want to know? Why drink and drugs?
More bang for your buck.
Oh, okay.
They were different. You got different. I mean, I liked the sort of usual hippie drugs, the LSD and the cannabis and that sort of stuff. I wasn't a great fan of the uppers, the speeds and things like that. I was more of a sort of mellow, downer person. And if you combine the two, particularly cannabis and the alcohol, then it was an interesting effect. It was a nice cocktail, as far as I was concerned, and they complemented each other, and I enjoyed that.
Was there any sense at that point that things were getting out of control?
There was one point where there was a sense of things getting out of control, and I don't know if you remember when we met the second time in Sidmouth. You and some people picked me up in a van, and I was wandering about the streets and looking for somewhere to sleep. And You picked me up and took me back because
Yeah.
otherwise the police would have picked me up. And at that time, I was probably close to, a breakdown because I had so many drugs and so many bad trips and alcohol, and my head was just scrambled. I was like a rake. I was, really, really thin, and I was in a bad way when you picked me up.
I do know then somehow you managed to get to the point where you got married and were working.
Yeah.
So did the drinking then, did it become less or did you just become better at it? I mean, how did you function? I know you came back and you picked up a bit of life.
Yeah.
Um,
I went back to Scotland, and my father became ill. I was going to go back to Scotland and then leave again. I was going off on the road again, and my father became ill with a cancer, and I thought, no, I can't leave. Even though I was pretty selfish and self-centered at that time, even I couldn't leave at that time, so I stayed. I got a job in this psychiatric hospital, and it functioned. Quite well. And we used to have these parties weekends, where we would get, lots of cannabis and lots of booze, and sometimes because we worked in a psychiatric hospital, we would sort of use the drug cupboards as a pick and mix, and um, so we had, say, some interesting parties. I met my wife in the pub, and I thought she's okay with this lifestyle, but it turned out she wasn't. She wanted me to change as soon as we got married, and I didn't. And my drinking changed then because we had one party in this it was a brand new flat that we had, co-ownership, brand new, nobody had been in it before. And I had invited all my friends along, and they didn't trash the place, but they made a bit of a mess. And after that, she said, no way.
yeah.
And after that, I started drinking alone.
Right.
That was a big change in my drinking habits.
So alone out, alone in the pub?
Alone in the pub,
Okay.
alone out. Sometimes I'd meet up with other people. I mean, I wasn't always alone, but a lot of the time I was alone.
So by then, her message was beginning to say, I don't like this. This is not
Yes.
good. Okay.
No, she said it almost as we were going back from the altar.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You will change. And I thought, oh no, I won't. And so, but the drinking escalated. It wasn't too bad. I became a binge drinker, but my binges were not, total abstinence and then and drinking. It was kind of heavy drinking, yeah, and kind of normalish drinking, heavy drinking, normalish drinking. It developed into sort of abstinence and not drinking, abstinence and then heavy drinking, abstinence, heavy drinking later on. That didn't come till later.
So what age are we talking here as this is beginning to escalate?
I got married when I was 25, and my drinking was beginning to escalate. But we moved. Eventually we lost the flat because we just couldn't afford it anymore. It was too expensive for us anyway, but my drinking was using up an awful lot of the money, and that didn't help. So we moved in with her mother, which was dreadful. And then we got this other flat, and I was fine, and I did the whole thing up and decorated it all. I rewired it all. I did lots and lots of stuff at that time.
So you're one of these people then, because there's quite a lot of them around, that managed to stay sober during the day and then, when you did your work and stuff, and then started in the evening.
Yeah. It hadn't got so much of a grip at that time. I was okay as long as I didn't start drinking. Once I started drinking, that was it. I was off and running. It was like getting a snowball at the top of a hill. As long as it hadn't gone over the hill, then it was fine. It was stable. But as soon as you put it over the hill, off it went.
Would you have called yourself an alcoholic?
I absolutely would not have called myself an alcoholic at that time. And I took an awful long time to call myself an alcoholic. Would I call myself an alcoholic now?
Looking back on it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But no, I was very reluctant to come to that conclusion.
Were there any interventions? We've been talking about interventions. Did anyone try to do interventions? Anything like that? Was it basically Your wife just saying, this is horrible, I don't want it?
Well, by interventions, I've talked about it a number of times that I would waken up and my wife would be sitting in the bottom of the bed with, with her list of things that I had done. And I have to say, that I wasn't a nice person when I was drinking. I was volatile. I could be great fun. I could be a nuisance, and I could be really aggressive. And it was a case of, it was like an alcohol lottery, or alcohol roulette. You pay your money and you find out what's going to happen. And that was kind of the way it was. And it wasn't very nice to her, because she would sort of say that she wanted me to change, and these fights would start, and it wasn't really good. I'm sorry for her.
Yeah. So it all came to a head. Tell us about that.
The last couple of years of my drinking were bad. They were really quite bad.
Were you with your wife then?
Yes, I'm still with her.
Okay.
The last couple of years of my really got really bad. My binges were getting longer and worse. I was taking lots of time off of work, and for a while I spent a while not selling double glazing. I took an aptitude test for as a salesman, and they said, never going to go for a job as a salesman, you're hopeless. But I had alcohol on my side. Found that if a couple of drinks, I had enough confidence to sell some double glazing. So being an alcoholic, I thought, with a couple of drinks, I can sell a wee bit of double glazing. If I have a few drinks, I'll sell a lot of double glazing. And then nobody would let me in the house because I was drunk, and so that didn't work. So I had a few jobs. I was a chauffeur, cran driver, and then I went back to psychiatric nursing again.
Okay.
And it was during that time that I was taking lots of time off work. Every time I took a binge, I'd take days, weeks.
Okay.
My wife, she was unhappy, very unhappy, and I cannot in any way blame her at all. Then my binges, as I say, got really long. So I was talking about weeks at a time now. My last couple of binges were months. And I was hallucinating. I was doing all sorts. I was half crazy. I was bouncing checks all over Glasgow. And eventually one day she said, she was standing there with a case packed, and she said, I'm leaving you. She said, I don't like you anymore. I don't love you anymore. And I'm leaving before I hate you. And she walked out. And I thought, good. Now I can drink in safety. Now I can drink like a gentleman. I'm okay. And off I went to the pub. And I found myself walking into the pub and saying the immortal words that I cringed even as I said it. My wife doesn't understand me. But now I'm okay because I can drink like a gentleman.
And what does it mean, drink like a gentleman? You mean you can get control? And
yes, I would be controlled in my drinking. I didn't have to be, I need to be back at home by 7 o'clock because the dinner will be on the table. She'll just be waiting for me. I can relax and I can,
I understand. Yeah.
That was what I thought.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. And obviously that wasn't what happened. That was total denial on my part. And I would binge, and I sort of would go to all these different pubs around Glasgow, and I wouldn't go to the same one twice just in case I'd said something or done something. I get assaulted in a few pubs, and one of them had somebody stuck a glass in my face.
So you're really beginning now to describe the real down and out drinker, the person that you compare yourself with if you're a drinker, that you're not like them.
Yes, but I had a house.
Yes, okay.
And I had a job, theoretically, so I was okay. Because this is me today, but I could stop any time I wanted.
You really still believe that?
Yes, I did. I could stop any time I wanted, but not today.
Okay.
Not today. Yeah. But I could. I really could.
So when did it all completely come to a head then?
It came completely to a head. As I say, my wife had left. I had been on a binge nearly 2 months. Sober morning. Drunk morning, noon, and night.
So you weren't at work
sober.
at that point?
Nope. And my work phoned up and said, "Where are you? Are you coming back?" And I said, "I'll be in that night." Crazy, absolute mad. If anybody said they were going to do that, I'd just go, "Don't do that." And I went in that night. They handed me the keys to the drug cupboard, and there I was, in charge of a ward. And I went into the DTs.
Can you explain what that is for people that don't understand?
The DTs are the severe form of withdrawal symptoms. It can be shaking, lots of shaking, very, very heavy shaking. It can even go into convulsions. Sweating, lots and lots of sweating. Hallucinations. And it can actually be fatal. It can be too much for the heart.
So hard to hide, so pretty obvious.
Yeah. And the nursing officer came in, and I was sitting there, and he just took one look at me and went, "Oh." And so he phoned up the office and got somebody to come relieve me, and they took me up to the manager's office, and he sat down. And when I sat there, I mean, I was just, as I say, I was in an awful state, and they really weren't sure what to do with me. If it wasn't working in that psychiatric hospital, they would have admitted me there and then. But because I was an employee, they felt they couldn't do that.
So this was real for you. Finally, you were facing the fact that you were in a terrible state. You couldn't hide it anymore. You'd be completely found out in the worst place, which is your workplace.
Yep.
So you were feeling absolutely ghastly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I was sitting there, and I've told this little story many times, and continued to tell it because it was lovely. The head of the hospital is standing talking to me, and I'm just going, "I'm a hopeless case." And he said, "You may well be, but you're not a lost cause." Now, that got through even that fuddled state. And he said, "Have you got anywhere to go?" And I said, "Well, I can go home." And he said, "No, you can't." He said, "Do you get anywhere you can?" No, I had been in and out of AA on a number of occasions.
Yeah.
And so I had at one stage got a sponsor. And the sponsor, he said, "What's his number?" So he phoned my sponsor, and he said, "Can you take him?" So they put me in a taxi and sent me to him. And he just took me and put me straight into bed. And he phoned a doctor right away because of the state I was in. And the doctor came in and said, "Right, I'm going to send him to the psychiatric hospital." And I said, "I work there." And he said, "No, you need to be in there. This is an emergency." And I said, "I'm not going there. I can't go there. You don't." And so he said, "Well, that's all I can do for you." So he left me, and I had convulsions, and I had all sorts. And I have to say, Big John, who was my sponsor, he was terrified. He told me later, he said, "I was coughing myself for about 3 days." He says, "Because I thought you were going to die." He said, "I was sure you were going to die." He says, "That's the worst I've ever seen."
So you were doing this, back in your flat?
No, it was in his flat.
It was in his flat?
In his flat.
Poor thing.
Yeah, I know.
Oh.
And so the hospital made me an appointment to see the head psychiatrist of our hospital. Went down to see him, and he just looked at me and he said, "No, you need to be in." And he sent me to the psychiatric hospital at the other side of the Glasgow. So I went down, got in my car, drove through the Clyde Tunnel, and got to the hospital, and they just looked at me and said, "Car keys, come in." And then they sedated me, and they just knocked me out. And then I dried out, and then eventually, I had a few tests and things, and the psychiatrist said, "Okay, you have got brain damage, you've got liver damage, he said, and if you continue drinking, you've got 6 months to live." And I went, "Oh, okay." But Many people, when I say that, they say, "Oh, but that's the reason you stopped," and it wasn't. It wasn't. I wasn't afraid to die, and there was many times I wanted to die. In that state, I just did not want to live. Many times I went to the pub and I would say, I hope a lorry comes round the corner and hits me, but please, could it do it on the way back from the pub? It's just the way I saw it. Okay. I had nothing to live for. It was my life was just desolate. It was just from where can the next drink come from? I was bouncing checks all over Glasgow. I didn't really care about dying. It wasn't my race.
So you're right at this point where you are very, very ill.
Yep.
But that wasn't enough. So what did it?
The mirror.
The mirror.
I think I was just looking in the mirror, but as I said, it's more like a mirror of the soul. And I realised what I'd become. That I was this horrible, selfish, self-centred person that would have tramped over the top of anybody just to get a drink. My life revolved around getting alcohol, and it didn't really matter who I hurt at that time. I didn't really want to hurt anybody, but I didn't want to hurt. And if I didn't get the alcohol, then I hurt. I was left with this feelings of inadequacy, these feelings of, guilt, these feelings of shame all the time.
It's a very powerful statement, really, that one, that you didn't want to hurt anybody, but you didn't want to hurt. Yeah. Would you say that that's a message that a lot of drinkers, what's going on inside of a lot of drinkers?
I think it is. I think it is. And I think that's, where we often say, it's not personal. If I'm hurting you, it's not personal. And you think, well, how can it not be personal?
Yeah, it feels very personal.
Yeah. Well, that's how it's not personal, because it's not about your heart, it's about my heart. Yeah. I'm trying to save myself from hurt. Unfortunately, you're the victim of that, and that's what it was like. But yeah, when I was in hospital, I realised, I don't want to do this anymore. I really don't. There was a group of people who were being tried out at the same time, and they were talking about the party they were going to have when they went out, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, are you coming? And I said, no, I didn't want that. I knew at that time, without a shadow of a doubt, I don't want to go back to that. And I'm not going to go back to that. Well, I knew if a shadow of a doubt I didn't want to go back to it. I wasn't sure that I wouldn't go back to it.
So what helped you at that point? This is AA that you went to, is it?
Yeah, I went to, the psychiatrist had this group, which was a kind of therapy group, which he ran once a week. And he had a facilitator there, and I went to that group. I also went to Alcoholics Anonymous as well. And then eventually I had to choose between the two groups. Just because time-wise and conflict. I mean, I got a lot from both of them, but I decided that, AA was much more ubiquitous. You could go to a meeting morning, noon and night, and I did go to them. Sometimes I went to 3 in a day.
Right, okay. So did you then try to pick up work? How soon after that did you work?
Yeah, I went back to work eventually. I was about 3-4 weeks before I could go back to work, because I was not in a good way. And I went back, and the boss took me up to his office, and he said, welcome back. It's good that you're back at work, and carry on, and I won't be watching you. And I said, well, you're a mug. I said, I would be watching me, I said, definitely.
He sounds like a really great person.
He was a lovely guy. And I can't thank him enough. It was lovely.
You can name him if you want to.
Yeah, his name was Jack Brown, and he was just a lovely, lovely guy. But it was also very fortunate, because he had sacked 3 people before me for drinking.
Oh, okay.
And then I came along, and he said, I can't keep doing this. We have to help these people. We're a hospital, we're supposed to help people. And I was the first recipient of that kind of. So there was a timing about it as well.
Now, just probably more briefly, obviously, but somebody quipped that you went from a drunk to a doctor in a decade. Can you just fill us in just quickly about that journey?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I did, because I tried to pick up my life again, and the first year wasn't easy. The first year really wasn't easy, you know, because I was doing things like going to work and etc. And without a drink now, everything was new to me, you know, at that point. And I felt like, you know, a kid with learning to cycle, you know, and they're just throwing away the trainers, you know, and all of us, I was teetering along. I went to a lot of AA meetings, and I went to. There was one that I had joined this group, and it was one stage, and then left it, and I got to my first AA birthday, and they celebrate, you know, and he said, "We want you to come and speak at our group," and I said, "Is that because I've made such a good recovery?" And they said, "No, it's because if you can get it, anybody can get it." And I thought, oh, I feel a wee bit deflated by that. But he was right. I was doing nothing right to begin with, you know. So it was that. I went back to education. I started to do maths and physics and thought, why am I doing this? You know, I work in a psychiatric hospital. Why am I doing maths and physics? So I decided to change to psychology. So I did.
Right.
I'd always been interested in psychology.
And you are a doctor of psychology.
I am.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you
so
did your PhD on change, I think, as well.
I did.
Yes. That. Yeah.
And I got an opportunity that came along to do some research.
Okay.
So, and that's when it was coined, you know, doctor to drunk to a doctor in a decade. But that came along really rather interesting, because I really didn't want anything to do with drinking anymore.
It's understandable.
I really, you know, and this lecturer from Glasgow University asked me to do some research on some stuff that he was doing. And I said, okay, but I found it pretty boring, you know, because it was really just, it was a kind of time and motion study, and there was no theory involved in it. And I wasn't really that interested. And so I made up my own study. And I got a fellowship from the Scottish office. And I left my work. I decided to just chuck it in and go and do this, because they wouldn't keep the job open for me. And it was about changing alcohol, you know. And but that really came about. There was a whole series of coincidences happened that, because what I was really interested in at that time was care in the community for psychiatry, because it was a time when everybody, you know, they were sending people at the psychiatric hospitals, and I wanted to do to find an assessment tool. But what I needed to be is I needed to be working and researching in the same place, and then I had a shuffle of all the wards, and I ended up in the alcohol ward.
Right. Okay.
And I thought, oh, so I had to change it all. And that's when I get involved in alcohol again. I thought, I don't want to do this. I just don't want to do it. And, you know, and I got given this fellowship to do it, you know. And then I was given another fellowship, which was a senior fellowship. I was already a postdoc. Then I got that. And then I was looking for a post as a lectureship. And I got they interviewed me for a lectureship in psychology post, and they haven't actually told me yet whether I got the job, but I assume not. And another post came up at the same time in the Centre for Alcohol and Drug Studies, and they gave me it.
That's where you ended up in Paisley.
I did. I ended up back doing what I did. I thought, I really don't want to do this, you know. But it was as if every time I walked away, doors shut, and every time I came back, the doors opened.
Like it was meant
and it
to
just,
be.
yeah, it was as if it was meant to be. And my life just changed. I mean, and I've been sober now for over 40 years, you know.
So it's a wonderful story. And it means, I mean, I suppose with our work, it means that you really understand. We're going to do, you know, these podcasts for drinkers. And just wanted to establish right at the very beginning, you are a professor of drink and drugs.
Yes.
You do know your subject matter.
Yes.
You are a psychologist.
Yes.
But what is more important probably to them is that you've walked the walk.
Well,
that we are trying to get them.
this is the interesting thing, because all my academic career, I never told anybody I was an alcoholic.
Did you not?
No,
Because why?
Because I wanted to be taken seriously as a researcher.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And and I didn't want people to say, right, he's just compensating for because I wanted to be a real researcher.
Yes.
The fact that I was a real researcher was neither here nor there. But that, I mean, I think a lot of people actually knew.
Yeah.
But nobody sort of said too much about it. But I wanted the respect of an academic. And now I find that people couldn't care less what degrees I've got. As somebody once put it, said, thermometers got loads of degrees, and look where they stick that. And I thought, yeah, it's a good way of putting it. But what people are really interested in is, how did you recover?
Yeah.
Where were you? How did you recover? And that, not my PhD, not my degree in psychology has become my biggest asset. My experience has become my biggest asset. And going right the way back, to somebody who didn't care for themselves, didn't like themselves, it's surprising that, that my biggest shame is my biggest asset.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's a wee bit of a turnaround, shall we say.
And a wonderful place to finish.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's been really, really helpful to hear and so encouraging.
It's a pleasure.
If you like what we're doing, please like and subscribe to this podcast and leave us a good review, because it always helps, and maybe share with someone else. We look forward to you joining us again soon. Bye-bye.